a methodology is actually continuing something that I've started, sort of developed with you over the past number of series. It actually began with the Golden Calf and developed further with the Phantom Akeda. Maybe it'll even develop a little further now. But basically, I'm going to be making use of a similar kind of methodology as we go forward. When I say making use of a similar kind of methodology, I don't really mean in a mechanical way. I don't think there's any sort of mechanical trick that you can apply to learning the Torah, and voila, you apply your trick and all of a sudden everything makes sense. The Torah is much too sophisticated and supple a document to be able to be amenable to those sort of magician's games. So really, when I say methodology, really there's obviously a lot of pieces of methodology. There's listening to what the text has to say. There's paying attention to the nuances, paying attention to the transitions, how A leads to B, how B leads to C, listening to what the commentators have to say, Rashi, the Ramban, others, listening to what the sages of the Medrash had to say, trying to figure out what they're trying to add to the discussion. There's a tremendous amount of sort of behind the scenes methodology, but there's two little pieces which I'll also be using, which are kind of specialized and distinctive, and I want to sort of reintroduce them for just a second. One of them is what I call where have we heard these words before. We've used this extensively in the Phantom Akeda, and basically this is when the Torah will quote itself. Again, the idea behind this, or the theory behind this, is that the Torah is essentially a minimalist document. It's a very concise document. It is a document that does not go out of its way to spend a long time telling you things. So if you look at the great and grand narratives of the Bible, they are very concise. 9 verses for the Tower of Babel, 15 verses for the story of Adam and Eve in Eden. These things would have taken up columns and columns of text if they were published in the Encyclopedia Britannica. They're very concise stories, and yet we sense that there's great meaning layered into these stories. There must be some method of layering this meaning. So I think one of the methods is that the Torah will occasionally quote itself. In other words, it will deliberately set up a series of phrases which appeared in an earlier narrative and then reuse them in another narrative. And the reader who is a little bit more advanced and who remembers and who's familiar enough with the text to remember that, oh yeah, that rings a bell. I've heard these words before. If you do that, if the Torah is giving you a key there to be able to understand the meaning of one narrative in light of the other. So what it's really saying is that if you really want to understand what's going on in story A, you have to understand how it relates to those similar ideas which come up in story B. I think the Torah is tipping us off to say that really these two stories shed light on each other, and you need to see how that's so. I'm not going to go into a lot of examples of this now. We'll see some examples in this lecture, perhaps in the next lecture, so you'll get it. But this methodology we'll just call where have we heard these words before, repeating words and phrases and ideas, and sometimes within stories, and sometimes it's not just one phrase, that one distinctive phrase repeats itself, only twice in Tanakh, here in another story, but it happens over and over again within story A. There's a dozen indications to story B, and that's what we saw, for example, in the last series of the Phantom Akeda when we talked about the story of the expulsion of Ishmael and the abundant and copious textual parallels to the story of the Akeda, the story of the Shunammite woman, the story of the sale of Yosef. All of these things really form a package of interwoven stories, and the way the Torah is indicating how they interweave is by using these textual quotations from one story to another. And it's up to us to kind of notice that and try to meditate a little bit about its meaning. So that is one piece that we'll be talking about. Where have we heard these words before? Another piece is this idea of chiasms. Please don't get scared off by the academic sounding name. We talked about this in a number of our series previously. Basically, for those of you who are listening to this for the first time, a chiasm is a series of inverted textual parallels, and that is not as fancy as it sounds. In Kabbalah, it's known as an Atbash system. Aleph is the first letter of the alphabet, Taf is the last letter of the alphabet, So beta is the second letter of the alphabet, shin is the second to the last letter of the alphabet, and the notion is that aleph in some sense mirrors taf, beta in some sense mirrors shin. That you can sometimes have a story which is constructed chiastically. In other words, the first element of the story is patterned after the last element of the story. You look carefully and you find that the second element of the story is patterned after the second to last element of the story, continuing third to first, patterned after third to last. There's all these parallels, and what these are doing, as we've talked about before, is focusing you on really two things. Number one is how the beginning of the story parallels or plays off the end of the story, how each one of these pairs, how the A part of each pair mirrors itself in part B, so we can understand something about A by seeing its mirror on the other side. That's true, but also what's really interesting is that the Torah is identifying, as it were, the center of the narrative. What it does with a chiasm is a chiasm sort of inexorably points like an arrow towards the center of something. The center of the alphabet would be mem, the middle letter. The chiasm, if the alphabet is built chiastically, it's pointing you towards the mem, pointing you towards the center. And the Torah, through a chiasm, is identifying for you the center of a story. When I say center, not necessarily the geographical center. In other words, it's not like you say, oh, well, the story is built chiastically. It's got 30 verses in it. The center is at verse number 15. It's not necessarily true. The literary center of the chiasm may well be in verse 27. You just have to look and see where the parallels lead you, and what the center, by the way, will have no parallel. Well, that's not necessarily true, but it doesn't seem to have a parallel. Sometimes the parallels to the center, as we've seen before, are in the outer edges of the chiasm. But let's not get confused with that for a second. Let's just for the time being, let's call it the singularity in the center. The center of a chiasm has no parallel. It's a single point that is in the center, and that in a certain way we would expect to see there something which is central, something which everything revolves around, almost like a center of gravity, some sort of idea that is central that the entire story revolves around. And that, by the way, is a fantastic thing, because if you can figure out the center of a story, it's really the Torah's way of commenting on the meaning of its stories. It's saying, if you want to understand what this story is about, understand that this is what it all revolves around. So the chiasm can be very enlightening, and sometimes pointing to a verse which is, seems to not really be so central, and saying, no, this is the center. When we were talking about the golden calf 2 series ago, we talked about how there was this huge chiasm in the entire second half of the book of Exodus, and it all boils down to one verse, this very trivial verse, apparently, which everybody seems to overlook, which seems to be the center of gravity for the whole second half of Exodus. It's this verse about the Jews mourning when they take off their jewelry and mourning after the golden calf. And then it's up to us to try to figure out why that idea is so central. And more often than not, that's not so hard to decipher once you notice what the Torah is pointing out as the central idea. So this is the idea of chiasms. Again, if you want some other examples of it, I refer you back to the lectures we've done in the archives. If you feel like you haven't quite figured out what it is that I'm talking about, if it all sounds too abstract, I'll try and put a PowerPoint in. I've had some PowerPoints on this in previous times, but I'll give you another introductory PowerPoint to chiasms you can look at if you like. But this is the idea. So 2 basic methodologies here. On the one hand, where have we heard these words before? On the other hand, chiasms, using these methodologies in concert with just plain reading the text, not getting lost, not trying to use these as magical tricks, but reading the text, being attentive to just pashut, simple, what these words are saying, what the story is about, what the nuances of the story are, but also paying attention to these overlays of meaning, paying attention to where have we heard these words before, these quotations to other stories, paying attention to a chiasm in the text. So these are important things. What I've begun to do in previous sessions with you over our last couple series is begin to look at the interplay between these 2 methodologies, and that's been of something of great personal interest to me. I hope you haven't found it too boring yourself, but basically what I'm suggesting is the following. Each one of these tools is very powerful on its own. To understand how a narrative in the Torah mirrors another narrative is a very powerful tool. The Torah is commenting. It's telling, if you want to understand narrative A, understand how it relates to narrative B. Chiasms, also very powerful. The Torah is telling you what the center of a narrative is, what it all revolves around. But what happens when you take the two together? What happens when these two things converge? What happens when a chiasm converges with where have we heard these words before? What does that look like? What it looks like is the following. Let's say you have story A and story B, and story A mirrors story B in a dozen textual references. So story A seems to be patterned after story B. And then let's say that I happen to notice that story B is structured chiastically. That the story B has this inverted series of literary parallels leading you right towards the center of the story, and identify a verse or a series of verses which that entire story revolves around. The next question is that if I see that story A parallels story B and story B has a center, has a chiastic center, the very interesting question is how does story A relate to story B's center? In other words, if there's a number of parallels in story A to story B, does one of those parallels reflect the center of story B? Is there something in story A which reflects the center of story B? If there is, then perhaps I understand fundamentally how these stories relate to each other. I understand how story A relates to the center of story B, or more precisely, perhaps, how the centers of these two stories relate to each other. That may be really what the Torah is getting at when it's trying to say this is how these two stories come together. Recently, I came up with this notion, actually just chatting with Barry. I happened to be in Santa Cruz for a lecture at Shabbaton, actually, a couple weeks back, and Barry was kind enough to drive from Walnut Creek to meet me there. I was chatting with him outside in the rain, actually, by the ocean, and we were talking about this, and the analogy of a wormhole came to mind, and I just want to elaborate on that because it really may be, I think, a very precise analogy to what I'm talking about here. It could be that there are wormholes, as it were, in the Torah. What is and the wormhole is this sort of dual center between story A and story B that happens when you have a chiasm and a reflected center of a chiasm. If all of that may sound very strange and weird, let me just backtrack and give you a sense of what I'm talking about. What is a wormhole? The idea comes from science, actually. Used to come from science fiction, but now seems to be, at least theoretically, a scientifically valid concept. The possibility of wormholes in space. What exactly is a wormhole in space? So just to give you a very brief background, it has to do with Einstein's theory of relativity, his theory, I believe, of gravity within the theory of relativity. And basically it works like this. Basically what Einstein suggested is that gravity is not really a force as we know it. It's not just some mysterious force, but it is a function of dense objects within space warping, as it were, the fabric of space. The analogy he gives to this is he says, imagine, you had the big plastic sheeting. You had a bowling ball that you put in the plastic sheet. The bowling ball would warp the fabric of the sheet, such that, if, for example, if you took a little tennis ball and you rolled it onto the sheet, the tennis ball would no longer go straight as it would across a simple flat surface like a table. But if there was a bowling ball in the middle of the sheet, so it would curve in towards the bowling ball, the tennis ball would. That's really what gravity is, according to Einstein. If you imagine the sun. So you imagine space. So space is the sheet. According to Einstein, space is supple. It is something. It's not nothing. It's not like there's this thing called nothingness called space. No, there's this thing called space. You can almost imagine it as some sort of three-dimensional fabric. But this thing gets affected by stuff in it. So if there is stuff in it, very dense things, everything can warp the fabric of space. Space curves in order to accommodate the things which are placed within it. So if you got the sun, this very big thing, there's this really large warping of space around the sun, and that's why planets orbit the sun. What's happening is that the planet, is in motion. Normal motion will just continue going straight, but the same way the tennis ball sort of arches and curves around the path of if you roll it, it'll curve around the path of the bowling ball. So if you roll it like real slow, it'll just hit the bowling ball. If you roll it real fast, it'll zoom past the bowling ball. If you roll it just right, though, it'll just keep on going around and around that center. And those are the orbits. If you notice, like tennis balls that are going in right close to the perimeter of where the bowling ball is, they'll be spinning real fast, and the ones on the outside will be spinning much slower. If you look at the circuits of planets, you'll find the same thing. The planets that are real close, Mercury, they'll go around the sun really fast, and the planets which are farther out will be going around Neptune, Pluto, these guys, they're going much, much slower. But that's the idea. It's not just that there's some mysterious force out there, but simply the planet is simply trying to find the simplest path in space. And the path in space is, if it's a curved path, so it's just following the curved path in space, the curve that is made through the bowling ball, through the sun, which is there. So this is Einstein's theory of gravity. It's a very interesting theory, and it was just a theory for a while until it was actually proven to be true. How would you prove Einstein's theory to be true? Well, once upon a time, back in the early 20th century, there was an eclipse that was scheduled. And the eclipse offered, the full eclipse of the sun, offered the possibility of proving Einstein's theory. Why? Well, here's the idea. If in fact space was a thing which gets warped, and anything that travels through it will follow the curve of that warp, so that means that gravity is going to affect everything. It's not going to just affect things, it's going to affect everything that travels through it, even actually light, which means that light is going to get bent by gravity too. What that should mean theoretically is that if you know where a star is supposed to be in the sky, but the light from that star, going from that star to your eye, is going to pass, say, right near the trajectory of the sun. So, there's the sun there, and just like 1 or 2 degrees off from there, there's that light coming from the star right past the sun to your eye. That light should bend as it passes the sun. What that means is that where you see the star will not actually be where the star is. That you know where that star X is going to be, but as the sun passes and comes close to that star is going to appear to bend. The light from that star is going to bend, and therefore the position of the star is going to look different once the sun is sort of between you and the star, or very close to where you and very close to the trajectory through which the light passes on its way to your eye. The problem is you can never actually see this because the sun is too bright. In other words, once the sun is in daylight and there are stars next to the sun, you'd never in a million years see the star next to the sun. It's right there. You'd never see it. But in a full eclipse, you could. Theoretically, in a full eclipse of the sun, you would be able to see the stars near the sun, and if you know where the star was supposed to be, Einstein's theory would be proven if the star wasn't there. If the star looked like it was off, right next to it, because it would show that the light is being bent as it passes the sun. So there was, in the early 20th century, indeed, a complete eclipse of the sun. Folks got on an ocean liner, went out into the middle of the ocean where this eclipse was, knew exactly where star X was supposed to be, looked up, and it wasn't there. It was actually off by a couple degrees, and in fact, Einstein's theory was proven. That was how Einstein's theory of gravity was verified. So no longer a theory, it's actually true. Space does seem to be a fabric. It does seem to actually bend in response to objects that are placed within it. The heavier, the more dense the object, the greater the bending in space. Okay, so now you're thinking, well, very nice, Forhman. That's all very nice science lesson, but what does this have to do with Torah? Okay, relax. We're not quite done with the science lesson yet. There's one little piece of it that we need to know, and then we can apply it back to what this has to do with our world, the world of text and the world of Torah. What happens if an object in space is extremely dense? Now we get to the concept of a black hole. What exactly is a black hole? A black hole is essentially, it's a collapsed star. And a collapsed star is a very dense thing, much denser than your sort of average star. Well, if you have a star which is big enough to begin with, and then it collapses, the gravitational force of that star is so huge that it literally pulls in everything around it, and nothing can really escape. We call this a black hole. If you would imagine this as, something, you would imagine this as an extremely heavy bowling ball. Nay, not really a bowling ball, but say something which is smaller than a bowling ball. Imagine something that tennis ball size, but having the mass or having the density so that, let's say, an entire house worth of, this thing weighs 3 tons. You have a 3-ton tennis ball weighing down the middle of the sheet. Well, it would have to be a pretty strong plastic sheet. So imagine there's this 3-ton tennis ball and it's just sinking all the way down there. Once something starts getting in that hole, it's not getting out so fast. This is a black hole. The question is, what might happen theoretically if you had 2 such things that came into contact with each other? For example, let's say you had 2 of these really huge tennis balls, right? And it just so happened that they were both weighing down there in space and just kind of knocking around, and then they touched one another and fused. That's a wormhole. At least theoretically, that is a wormhole. And what a wormhole would allow for, theoretically, is passage through the fabric of space and time. And this, again, is a theoretical basis, perhaps, for time travel. I really don't want to get into that now. Let's just keep it simple. Moving from one space to another very quickly, right through space. So in other words, I'm not traveling through space like I normally would, but I'm taking a shortcut through a wormhole created by two ultramassive objects which happen to touch each other and create sort of a tunnel through space. If there are wormholes and the theoretical basis for them seems to exist, what would be the implication of these things? Well, very briefly, what wormholes might do is solve two fundamental problems in physics. They might allow for information to pass between vastly separated regions of space, communication, as it were, between vastly separated regions of space. You could theoretically have region A, which is millions of light years away from region B, but being affected by region B by virtue of a wormhole that connects these two things. If you stuck with the speed of light, it would take you hundreds of millions of years to get from point A to point B. But if you travel through the wormhole, it could take you a day and a half. So you could actually have communication between these two realms of space. One realm of space could reflect on the other realm of space, even though they're separated by incredible bounds. Similarly, by the way, it also is a vehicle for creating unity in the laws of nature, unity in the laws of physics throughout all of space. Scientists do believe that there is unity between all the laws of nature. No matter where you are in the universe, the laws of nature and the laws of physics are the same. But theoretically, there's a problem with that, which is that these things are separated by such vast distances that how do you know that that the laws which applied in one place apply to the other place? Maybe these are just discrete separate regions. But if these regions are linked somehow, it provides for sort of a theoretical framework for there being fundamental unity between these very far-flung areas. Now, coming back to the Torah side of this, what I would like to suggest is that maybe if these things exist that I'm describing, these two methodologies, if they're really out there in the Torah, they may be sort of the Torah equivalent of what a wormhole in space might be. Just to give you an idea of what it is that I'm talking about, you could conceive of, if you imagine you have these two vastly separate regions of the Torah, separated by different books, seeming to have sort of nothing to do with each other. I remember, by the way, once speaking to a certain Bible scholar, I'll leave his name out of the discussion, but wrote a very famous popular book about the Bible and its supposed authorship, and certainly was not religious by any means, and subscribed to the sort of many authors theory, cobbled over time view of how the Torah came to be. And I showed him some of my work, which pointed really to a deep unity within the Torah, and many different sections of Torah shedding light on each other and seeming to have this sense of unity. And he said, how can that be possible? He says, you can't talk to anybody at this conference about this. They won't give you the time of day. I mean, if this was written at this time and this was written at that time, how could I said, but just look at the evidence. I mean, how can you explain these dozen specific language parallels between these various things? It seems to be one unified piece. They really seem to be commenting. It just makes sense. He says, but how could you explain how that could occur? I said, I don't know. I can't explain how it could occur. It's not a matter of explaining. It's a matter of, this is what the evidence suggests. I believe, I can't really tell you exactly how this is, but maybe being a religious person, this is how I see it. But that the Torah is unified, that even religious people don't believe that the author of Genesis is the author of, say, the book of Samuel. A human being wrote the book of Samuel, even if God was the author, as it were, of Genesis via Moses' pen. But nevertheless, in the cosmic scheme of things, somehow there is a unity, and it's a deep kind of unity between these things. And it just seems to be the way Providence put together the Bible, that it's a whole work, and as a whole work, the way God somehow made it all work out is that it is a unified whole, and the different pieces of it shed light on other pieces, and I can't really explain it, but I think it's there, and I think that it's real. If there are wormholes in space, maybe there's wormholes in the Torah. If you think about what a wormhole is a connection between two different vastly separated regions that allows for uniformity. And if you think, by the way, even visually, the notion of a chiasm is very similar to this wormhole. It's this thing sort of leading towards a center and leading you through deeper and deeper in the center. Maybe as you go through that center, you come out on the other side. You come out to a connected part of the Torah, which is its reflection in another world, in another part of the universe. It's how these same ideas from part A gets reflected in part B, and there's a deep connection between these two apparently vastly dissimilar realms of Torah, but they're connected. They're connected through this little tunnel, through that center of a chiasm that brings story A to story B. These two parallel stories brings them in relation to one another and defines the nature of what it is that they're meant to tell us, and the nature of their fundamental relationship. So these are some ideas. They just occurred to me. It could be wild speculation. I don't know. But I think the notions of chiasms are not wild speculation, and the notions of where have we heard these words before are not wild speculation. They really are there, and sometimes they happen together. That, I think, is beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's up to us to try to make sense of it when it happens. Again, I don't want to get too caught up just on the technicalities of these methodologies. We will use them, but again, we have to simply read the stories as well. But these are parts of the methodology that I'll be trying to go with you. What I'm going to suggest to you is that the book of Genesis is one very large unified document. It's telling you a unified story. Along the way, chiasms and where have we heard these words before, those methodologies will be very interesting and very helpful, I think, in weaving together how fundamentally the book of Genesis is unified, how it really is all about one long developing story, literally from the very first verses in the book of Genesis, in Bereshit, from the creation of the world, to the very last verses of Joseph and his brothers and Joseph on his deathbed. And I think it gives us a launching point, really, perhaps, for viewing the entire Torah. Part of that story, I think, is what we talked about in our last series in the Phantom Akedah, the expulsion of Ishmael and the Akedah. That, I think, is the middle of the story. But there's a beginning of that story, and there's an end of that story. The beginning of the story is what we're talking about now, from Adam to Abraham. The end of that story we'll talk about later. It's the Joseph stories. We'll talk about that too. That's sort of the sequel. But for now, let's jump in. Let's look at the beginning of the story, from Adam to Abraham. What story does the Torah begin to tell us? Not just discrete events. Again, we're not just looking at verses in isolation and analyzing what all the different commentators have to say about the verse, then going on to the next verse. We're not even looking at individual stories in isolation. We're trying to discern a story as it unfolds. That is the task that I'm setting before us right here in the book of Genesis. Now, I'm just about out of time here for this sort of introduction to this series, but I do think this is a good way, perhaps, of introducing what I'm trying to get across here. But let me give you some homework, if I can, to think about for next week and where we're going. I'd like to set up, if I can, the first little bit of framework for trying to understand the book of Genesis. And maybe we'll do it this way. Let's talk about the creation narrative. When we talk about the creation narrative, one of the things that has often puzzled people is that there's not one. There's actually more than one. There's two creation narratives. And this has been kind of difficult to understand. Why do we need to hear about creation twice? If you go through Genesis chapter 1 into the very first verses in chapter 2, we seem to have a very nice discrete story, the story of creation. It starts with, in the beginning, God created not the Adam and the Eve, but the heavens and the earth. And the earth was tohu vavohu, it's formless and void, but then God said, let there be light, and then, what do you know, we have 6 days of creation, and every day something new gets created. Finally, on the very last day of creation, the 6th day, God creates people, God creates first animals, God creates people, and before you know it, you have a universe. And then, at the very beginning of chapter 2, in the 7th day, God rests, and it sounds like that's the end of creation. Vayichulu hashamayim v'aretz v'chol tzva'am, and the earth and the heavens heavens and the earth and all of their hosts were finished. And you think, they're finished. But the problem is they're not finished, because if you read chapter 2, if you keep on reading at chapter 2, we seem to again hear about the entire story of creation one more time. And the question is, why do we have to hear it again? And we hear about the creation from an entirely different standpoint. Let's see if I can read you a little bit to give you a sense of what it is that I'm talking about. Chapter 2. These are the generations of heaven and the earth as they were being created when God made them. And then before everything before there was rain, and before God had caused rain to come down on the land, and before there was man to make the things grow out of the ground. So this is what happened. God created man out of the dust of the earth and breathed the breath of life, and man was a living creature. And then God created the Garden of Eden, and then God made all these things in the Garden of Eden. He made the Eitz HaChaim, the tree of life, and he made the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then he said it's not good for man to be alone. And then we have a geography lesson. We hear about all these different rivers coming out of Eden, and then we hear about how there was no Eve yet, by the way. There was no woman, there was just man. And then God brings all the animals to see what man will call him, and man names them all, and the man decides none of them are a good mate. And then he meets Eve and says, Eve is terrific, she's a good mate for me. And then there's a whole story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. This seems to be another creation story. It seems to repeat elements, not all of the elements, but some of the elements of creation story number 1. We hear about the creation of man in story number 1, but then we hear about the creation of man in story number 2. So this seems like a problem. Now, this is a problem that has not escaped, obviously, the notice of commentators over the ages, but if you talk to your average secular biblical critic, they will find with great glee evidence in this that there is, in fact, more than one author here, and there's two discrete ways of looking at this, and there's two completely separate texts which were made up at different points in history, and then cobbled together by some editor, but the sloppy editor didn't realize that he didn't manage to make these texts consistent with one another, so they contradict each other. Was man created before? Was he created after? Was Adam and Eve created together? Was he created one first and one afterwards? They notice that the word for God appears differently in story 1 and story 2. They argue that this author was the Elohim author, this author was the J author, the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei author, and they didn't manage to sort of coordinate things as well. That, of course, is one way of looking at it, but it comes with the preconceived notion that I think that the Bible is inherently a disjointed, ununified document. There is another way of looking at it, of course, and that is that the Torah is in fact a unified document. Nevertheless, there are apparent problems and contradictions within the unified document that are in fact windows to a deeper meaning in the text. It's the Torah's designated way of getting you to look at two different aspects of a thing and be able to examine sometimes an internal tension within a text. And for those of you who've been with us in lectures, I think you have a sense of what I'm talking about in previous lectures, but to quote from someone else, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik of blessed memory, has a very famous essay where he talks about this. He talks about Adam 1 and Adam 2. He argues that there's a fundamental tension. I think I may have mentioned this essay in previous classes, either last series or the series before, so I'm sorry if I'm boring you and repeating myself, but he argues that there is an essential tension within mankind, and the reason why there's a tension in the creation stories is because it reflects an actual real tension in human nature, a tension between the kind of Adam that is discussed in the first creation story and the kind of Adam that is discussed in the second creation story. And I'll refer you can certainly read his essay on this. I believe that it is Lonely Man of Faith, if I'm not mistaken, where that appears. You probably can find it on the web. If I can find it for you, maybe I'll give you a link to it. Otherwise, you can buy it in book form as well. But again, two very different theories. A theory based upon the notion that the Torah is disjointed and cobbled together. A theory based upon the notion that the Torah is fundamentally unified, and apparent disunities are sometimes two aspects of a different thing. Well, who's right? Is Rabbi Soloveitchik right? Is the sort of traditional view of things right? Or is the critical approach right in terms of this being fundamentally disjointed? Well, obviously my sympathies are with the traditional approach, but what I'd like to argue to you is that in this case at least, we can prove the traditional approach is correct. I think we can prove it. We can prove it via the methods which I've described before. There very clearly is, believe it or not, I think a fundamental unity between the two creation stories, and you can prove that they work together and form a seamless whole. I think there's a literary proof that this is in fact true, and that's what I want to get to next week. And let me again just steer you in the direction of my thinking. The nature of the proof, which will evolve, I think, and I'm interested not just because I want to prove this point, but I'm really interested from a perspective of meaning, because I think it sheds light upon the whole meaning of the creation story. But here's what we're going to do next week. What I'm going to argue to you is that there is a hidden creation story. By the way, the theory here is not my own. The theory comes from a fellow by the name of Yitzchak Etz Shalom. You can find his theory on the web. If you do a Google search, I think next week I'll give you a reference to it. But see if you can do it without looking up his essay. If you want to cheat and look up his essay, you can. But he's certainly where I first got the idea from, and I think I've taken it just a little bit further. But the idea is that there is a hidden creation story within the Bible. It's not just creation 1 and creation 2, which is so obvious in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. The first story of the creation of the world in the 6 days, followed by a recapitulation of part of that story with the creation of Adam, and then the creation of the animals and the creation of Eve. Those are not the only 2 creation stories. There in fact is another hidden creation story much later on in the book of Genesis. And where does it appear? It appears, by the way, in the story of Noah. It appears in the aftermath of the flood. Here's your homework. See if you can find it. Examine the aftermath of the flood. Look at the aftermath of the flood. It's a story not just of the creation of the world, but of the recreation of the world. The world is being created again. I'll talk more about the significance of that and why it might be so. We can make all sorts of theories about that. We're not up to the theory stage. Let's just gather the facts. The facts seem to be that if you look about how the world was rehabilitated after the flood, you seem to find one after another in order, going right through it, parallel after parallel, linking you back to the creation story. Ultimately, I think this has a very significant impact upon what we were talking about with the Bible critics and Rav Soloveitchik. We'll get to that next week, and I want to get to that quite now, but here's your homework. See if you can find these parallels. Go through the story of the aftermath of the flood. You'll find it in Parshat Noach. You'll find it, I believe, in chapter 8 or so. You can start from, let's see, yes, chapter 8 in the book of Genesis. Open up to chapter 8, find another Bible, open up to chapter 1, and just start comparing. Where does this list lead you? What do you come up with? How far does it go? How far do these parallels go? What do they possibly mean? These are all questions we're going to come back to next week. I hope you'll join me. Look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.